Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Global Connections Television is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website, you like our shows, and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're going to take a look at the role of the United States, and a key role that the United States has played, is playing, and possibly will play in the future in dealing with major international problems such as climate change, or the development of nuclear weapons, or potential development of nuclear weapons in North Korea and Iran. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Gregory Hall. Dr. Hall is an associate professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, USA. He's also the president of the Bluegrass Chapter of the United Nations Association of the USA. Dr. Hall, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Bill, thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into some really tough issues in just a moment.
Certainly.
Let's talk just for a moment about the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. What is its main mission?
Sure. The Patterson School, which is going on its 60th year next year, is a master's program in international affairs, one of about 40 or so in the country, well established. And at Patterson School trains students to be practitioners and policymakers and analysts in all corners of international affairs.
It's a very, very important institution in the foreign relations area. And our viewers can go to your website at uky.edu/Patterson School to get more information. As I mentioned in the opening, you are also the president of the Bluegrass Chapter of the United Nations Association. You and I are both involved in UNA USA, which is the largest nonpartisan 501c3 association in the United States that deals with international issues. You have a very active Model UN program, do you not?
Yes, we're excited, and UK has just formalized the Model United Nations, and starting this fall, we'll actually offer a Model United Nations class. I was involved with Model United Nations before even arriving here when I was at Morehouse College. We traveled, competed, and of course, United Nations is the cornerstone organization for diplomacy, development, and international peace and stability. And Model or Mock United Nations, obviously, it's patterned to have the deliberations and do what United Nations does.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And of course, the UN impacts our lives every day. We don't realize it. And the UN helps move aircraft in international airspace, move ships on the high seas, weather information, postal letters, packages, things like that, that works with the governments to move them safely around the world. But the UN impacts our lives every day. And of course, our viewers can go to the website, www.unausa.org, to get more information. I should mention, too, that the United Nations Association is not part of the UN. It's just interested in what the UN does.
Of course.
So there's a sharp distinction there. Well, let's jump into some of these issues. We got something to talk about. The current situation, what is the current status, and this will change 5 minutes after you say it, I'm sure, but what is the current situation between Russia and the United States? The relationship has been frosty, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it gets frostier and frostier. It seems like each year after the Cold War. It's beyond dysfunctional, but definitely at the state-to-state or government level, it's in a poor state. Clearly, there are connections at the individual level, key leaders and elites, and things are perhaps a bit better there. But this is it's troubling the extent to which the relationship continues to unravel on a downward spiral.
Mm-hmm. And just recently we saw the United States withdrew from Russia the intermediate nuclear force weapons system, nuclear system. What is going to be the impact of that?
Sure. As fraught with the difficulty that the INF treaty was, it was a symbol and an example of major power cooperation between nuclear armed states. Many observers and strategists believe that it's going to unravel all the more. First, there was the ABM, or Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which the U.S. pulled out from in 2002. Now INF, JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement. Of course, the U.S. backed out of that. So many believe that this is just it will open the door for all kinds of updates and modernization of nuclear weapon systems, and even proliferation ultimately to actors that are not nuclear powers now.
Are we really getting into another nuclear arms race? Is that where we're heading with this?
It could be.
Excuse me.
It definitely could be. And particularly as countries like China continue to modernize and increase their forces, and also newer proliferators like Pakistan. So we could see a new arms race that's led by the U.S. and Russia, but others would jump on the bandwagon and proliferate as well.
And that is very dangerous for many reasons. One, that who knows where this arms race will end. You just don't know when to stop it. And there are also accidents can happen.
Certainly. We
know of at least 12 incidents since back in the 50s where nuclear weapons were almost shot off and were almost exchanged. And if that happens, that's basically the end of living organisms on planet Earth. I mean, that's the end of the line for us. And also from the financial standpoint, the United States has a $22 trillion budget deficit right now. And people say, well, this arms race will only cost $1 trillion. Forget it. It'll cost far more than that. None of these government programs ever come in under budget. But this could really be devastating, very debilitating for the world, couldn't it?
Certainly. And even conventional war now, among nuclear armed powers, that conventional conflict, it already has a nuclear component. So all the more dangerous. And in a time when obviously the wealth divide, the lack of services or declining services for people all over the world, it puts us in a pretty tough spot.
It certainly does. Now, you mentioned the Iranian nuclear deal, and this, as I recall, was cracked by the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, the US, UK, Russia, China, and France, plus Germany. Germany joined in too. And that was, I think, June of 2015, something like that. And the Iranians, the only goal from that, as I understand it, was to make sure that Iran did not develop a nuclear weapon. That was the goal, and the Iranians were actually abiding by it.
Certainly.
Now the United States has withdrawn from that. What does that portend for the future in that area, which is already a very volatile area?
Well, there are many difficulties and relationships are fraying over it. The transatlantic relationship over the Iran deal, the extent to which European interests and companies and the governments will hang on to their end of the deal, and so these things are up in the air. And then, of course, at a point, when does Iran determine that it's no longer in its interest to abide by the remnants, if you will, of the deal, the extent to which it remains in place, and decides to break out. And I'm also troubled with the newer revelations, recent revelations of U.S. Saudi attempts to put together a deal on nuclear technology. That could definitely impact the calculus from Iran's side.
Seems that by withdrawing, the United States is really destabilizing that area of the world, because right now the United States is putting pressure on the Europeans to join this coalition against Iran. Well, if that happens, which the Europeans are not joining at this point, but if that happens, then the Iranians are going to say, forget it, we'll just do nuclear weapons. We'll go back to testing, or developing and then testing. And then what is the next step? The next step is probably war, and that certainly isn't going to resolve the problem.
No. No, indeed, yes, and these situations involve actors beyond the principal players. Israel, at a point, Egypt, Turkey. There's a lot more proliferation to be attempted if we don't have regimes, mechanisms in place to at least slow down the process.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned Saudi Arabia and the transfer of nuclear technology. Probably the last country in the world that needs nuclear technology or to develop a nuclear weapon is Saudi Arabia, given its poor track record in so many different areas. What is the rationale for the Trump administration to think about giving this, or selling, either way, this technology to Saudi Arabia?
Well, the reports seem to show, and this is disappointing, that it's basically driven a profit motive, financial gain for the parties involved. But obviously the implications go far beyond the financial motive, and they touch on the regional stability and security.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And another area that we haven't talked about, we should, is North Korea. We think back to last year, the Singapore summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, and that was, I believe, in June of this past year. And so there was another summit coming up soon, but what really, after that summit, the North Koreans did not abide. Well, they didn't do anything. They just went on with their program, did they not?
Yes. In my own opinion, symmetry at this level, the supreme leaders either side, we're not there yet. I think that's really the, if you will, that's the cart. And really the first part of the horse should be and understandings on either side of what denuclearization means. And specifically in an operational sense, what is the United States expected to do from the North Korean side as regards denuclearization? That's not even talked about, but the North Koreans have a very clear idea that for them, a stable Korean peninsula means, in part, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, at least some of the U.S. forces from Japan and South Korea. And so I don't think that this is at the point yet where we're ready for the two leaders, the top leaders, to be engaged. These things can be hammered out by the diplomats and by the technical people on either side.
But it seems to me that the North Koreans, according to the analyst, will never give up their nuclear weapons because they saw what happened to Gaddafi. They realize it's a lever. They probably never want to use them because there are no winners if you have nuclear exchange.
Sure.
But they will probably never give them up. What do you think?
The regime survival is the number one goal. And the takeaway from Libya, Gaddafi, as you mentioned, and even the Kosovo War in 1999 and other episodes, the lesson seems to be, and the North Koreans have been very clear about this, that their nuclear weapon deters the U.S. because it's really a threat to U.S. forces in the region, but now increasingly with the development of their ICBM capability, threats to the U.S. homeland itself. And so, yeah, these weapons ensure, from the North Korean perspective, regime survival.
Exactly. And we've saved the biggest problem, climate change, right, just towards the very end of the program. A lot of people believe that climate change is our number one problem. Our Defense Department has studies showing that one of the major causes of instability in the future is climate change, will be climate change. We see that there are climate change refugees. The climate is changing dramatically. The glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, the reefs are under tremendous pressure, desertification is taking place, and still the United States withdrew from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which brought all the countries of the world together. Over 194 entities came to sign on to this. What does that portend for the future?
Oh, well, clearly if we don't change our ways, the disasters will get worse. One doesn't have to be a scientist, and the scientists do an excellent job of breaking these things down for the lay person. We have to do things differently. We have to cut our emissions. We have to clean up our trash, our plastics in the oceans, as we've discussed. We have to make headway there, and this Green New Deal, and I'm still trying to understand this as a mini. It's, if nothing else, it's a great starting point for talks and debates, and we all have to get into the mindset that we have to change how we live. We have to change what we produce and how much we produce and consume. Period.
Exactly. And it's going to be a new day. And it doesn't mean you have to give up your car, your air conditioner, things like that, because really the growth industry now is not in the fossil fuels. Coal is a dying industry, regardless of what people say. Coal is going, and the market is putting coal out of business. That's what's happening.
Yes.
But the business, really the thriving areas with solar, wind, over 250,000 jobs created in the United States, and you got, what, 67,000 coal miners. Now, coal miners need to be helped, no doubt about that, because when economies change and industries change, you need to help people who are really left behind.
That's why we have governments.
Well, that's right. Hopefully to come in and provide educational programs and assistance and that type of thing. But it is certainly going to be a different day. And if we don't deal with this problem now, it's going to be much more expensive tomorrow.
Indeed. Yes, and the conversation needs to be injected more with these elements that we have to do things, we have to work together, and we have to provide and redirect resources to get on the track in that way. Certainly.
Yeah. We certainly do, and we need to do it. Well, one thing has become apparent as we look at all these situations, North Korea, Russia, with the nuclear INF treaty, with the climate change agreement, that type of thing, that the United States is withdrawing from these treaties. And it seems like by doing so, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're destabilizing all the areas. We're really elevating some of our, what we call, quote, adversaries. Xi in China, Putin in Russia, we're putting them in the forefront, and they're taking a leadership role in many of the areas where the United States is withdrawing.
And China, under President Xi, is well poised, as was stated by Xi at the most recent Party Congress, to take this leading role. And of course, China-led world order with contemporaries, counterparts, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, it will look very different than the American-led world order that we've seen in place since the end of the Second World War, as we well know. And I believe these are historic times because the fraying of relationships, particularly across the Atlantic, you see particularly with the U.S. and Germany, U.S. and Canada, and there are other examples. It's really troubling. And then, of course, that's sort of the propping up by President Trump of bona fide dictators and authoritarians who clearly have no interest in participatory systems, in sharing authority with others in society.
Right. When you talk about dictators, you think of Duterte in the Philippines.
Certainly.
Putin in Russia, Al-Sisi in Egypt.
Yes.
There are quite a few of them around the world.
Quite a few.
Exactly. Well, by really withdrawing from these international agreements, which are not perfect, but at least they put us on the right track, and they did stabilize the world, and we have benefited from them. The United States has benefited for the last 75 years, 75 almost, from the founding of the United Nations and these agreements. But this is really a very destabilizing situation. We're actually, and you correct me again if I'm wrong, but our military is powerful. There's no doubt. No other military in the world is even close to the U.S. $750 billion budget. We've got aircraft carriers, all kinds of things, over 800 bases around the world, that type of thing. But from the other standpoint, from our interactions with other people, it seems to me that we're actually weaker today than we've ever been. And public opinion around the world, except in countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Israel, public opinion of the United States government has just deteriorated. It's in the basement.
Goes from bad to worse.
It is absolutely atrocious. Now, fortunately, it doesn't carry over to the American public. People around the world still like people in the United States, but they do not like the way that we're conducting business by really turning into an isolationist country.
Indeed, yes, and one with an attitude a country that's not inviting to others, even for work, and that sees itself as a country that's beyond exceptionalist, but a country that is not going to be a partner in dealing with our legitimate transnational problems that we need global cooperation on. Certainly.
Exactly, you're absolutely right. And there is no way in the world that the United States is going to eliminate the drug trade, combat climate change, deal with refugees, deal with crisis flashpoints in Ukraine or wherever it may be, or in the Balkans, without other partners.
There's no other way.
You can't do it by yourself.
No.
You know, and the American public doesn't want the U.S. to be the police person of the world, the
Certainly.
policeman of the world. We don't want that, but you still have to work with other folks. And it seems to me that of all the discussion that we've had today, that the one thing we should be doing right now is to get back into the nuclear agreement to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, to bring in other key players. When we're talking to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, get back into the Paris climate change agreement.
Certainly.
And get back into these agreements, because they were actually working and they shared the burden.
Yes.
But you've got to have partners to do this.
Yes. Again, the nature of the problems, the scope of the problems necessitate multilateral cooperation. And obviously, national interests are going to diverge, but these agreements provide a forum for continual discussion, debate, and adjustment in global as well as national interests.
Now, that was my suggestion, get back into the agreements. Are there any other things that we can do? What can we do to really stabilize the situation, to develop more partnerships and friendships with other people around the world, especially with NATO, which we've had a tremendous working relationship, and now that's on shaky ground.
It starts at the top, and so for U.S. foreign policy, U.S. foreign affairs, there has to be one voice, and the State Department, really all of the cabinet heads have been diminished in the Trump era, and typically it's your Department of State or your Foreign Ministry that articulates the policy on any given day. So the one voice, and that the leaders and the cabinet heads can't be contradiction each other. It's amazing the confusion in diplomatic circles that's expressed about U.S. policy intentions. And well, is the word of the Secretary of Defense or State on any given day, is that policy? Will that person be contradicted by the U.S. President? So speak with one voice, encourage cooperation and respect, and continue to cultivate the partnerships that you've had for decades.
Exactly. And that's the problem. We have little respect for our governmental representatives. I mean, that's what it boils down to today, because you don't know who's actually telling you what's going to happen.
You don't.
You talk to one person and it changes the next day or sometime that day. But you've got to have a cohesive, coordinated, really logical, well-prepared foreign policy that deals with all these different issues.
Indeed.
Or we're really in dire straits, to put it mildly.
Yes.
So, well, in the last 30 seconds we have, Dr. Hall, what do you recommend to cure all these problems over and above what we've been talking about?
Well, people need to be engaged, continue to be engaged. There was high turnout in the recent midterm elections, but it goes beyond that. People need to be plugged in, and they definitely need to pursue varied sources of media and information, and press their lawmakers and policymakers, and to continue to remind them, you work for us at every level.
Exactly. And the media do play a critical role in this and getting the word out and help people better understand these issues.
Certainly.
Because so often we just get a little clip or a little flash of what's going on in North Korea or in Venezuela or whatever it might be. But we really do have to dig deeper, and we have to learn much more about these issues.
Yes.
And of course, one place they can do it is if they watch Global Connections television.
Indeed.
Put in a plug there. But these are important issues, and they are life and death issues.
Yes, they are.
literally, when you talk about destabilizing the Middle East, you could see a war over there that could literally pull all the powers into it and have a nuclear exchange. But Dr. Gregory Hall from the University of Kentucky, Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.